Hey, friends, we just wanted to invite you to one of our favorite events of the year, Revoice. It is an incredible conference happening June 17th through 20th in Columbus, Ohio. So, we wanted to share with you briefly just some of our top reasons for why we go to Revoice and why you think you might enjoy it too.
For me, my first reason for loving going to Revoice is the worship. Everyone in the room at Revoice has given up something to follow Jesus, and that creates a worship atmosphere that really is like no other that I've experienced. You almost can't even describe it with words. You just have to be there to experience it.
Second reason is definitely the breakouts. Outside of the main sessions, which always bring a lot of great speakers, the breakouts from a variety of people in the community are really incredible. The content is so rich. I've been so equipped, not just intellectually and learning about new ideas, but spiritually as a disciple of Jesus, being exposed to new ways of growing in the scriptures, new ways of applying them, new ways to walk together with Christ in community, in just all parts of the holistic discipleship. Really recommend scrolling through the breakouts that are available this year.
And our third reason, which might be actually the most important reason, is just all of the incredible people that you meet at Revoice. David, Frank, and TJ and I all met at Revoice. I've met so many lifelong friends at the conference, so many people who've ended up joining a local Revoice chapter, or people who I've gone on vacations with, or people who I've been able to reach out to when I was going through a hard time as a queer Christian. Just the people at Revoice are a clear image of God's nature, his kindness, his generosity, and they filled me with faith. So I don't really know how else we can convince you to come, but if those three reasons aren't enough, I don't know what's going to convince you.
If you are convinced, then please stop by our new kinship table. We try to have a little new kinship after party one of the
Oh,
evenings
yeah.
at our Airbnb because we just want to hang out with people more and get to know people. So we'd love to connect and hope to see you there.
Hope to see you at Revoice.
Hello and welcome to another episode with New Kinship where we have the whole co-host team here together. My name is David Frank.
Hi, I'm TJ.
Hey guys, I'm Tyler.
And we are here with Erin Moniz, an author of Knowing and Being Known. I heard about this book at Revoice this past year and then bumped into Erin at a dinner and was super excited about the work. So I'm really glad we have you here today, Erin. Thanks for joining.
I'm so excited to be here. Very, very glad to be with all of you.
Woo, 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 woo. So could you begin with just telling us a little bit about yourself, Erin? Where you from? Who are the people in your life? Have you connected with kinship and such in your life?
Yes, absolutely. So I am in Waco, Texas. I work at Baylor University. I'm a chaplain there. But before that, lived in Georgia, was a chaplain there at a liberal arts school, and then before that, lived in Nashville, Tennessee. So bounced around a little bit, but I'm really happy to be here. I've been here about 4 years. And I'm ordained in the Anglican Church. I'm a deacon in the ACNA, so I also serve as an assistant clergy at our church here, All Saints Waco. And I've been in college ministry for a little over a decade, but student ministry for over 25 years, and love working with emerging adults. And I'm cishet. I'm married. To my husband Mike, and the two of us live with our two cats, which is basically our babies. And we have a life that is rich with people of all stripes that we love having kind of the ability to open our home to, figuratively and literally, in many ways. So that's a little intro.
Would you tell us more about how you've been connected to the Side B movement? You've been to Revoice.
Absolutely.
Maybe there's other ways as well.
Yeah. So I actually heard about Revoice first from Wesley Hill, who was my thesis advisor. So I did my doctorate on the information that eventually ended up in the book, Knowing and Being Known. and Wes was my supervisor for that project. And but honestly, even before then, the Lord is just delighted in bringing LGBTQ people into my life. And over the years, that has taught me a lot. And I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've come to really cherish people who have been incredibly instrumental in my own walk with the Lord, in understanding some of these topics. Some of the topics I write about in the book come straight from lessons that I have learned from being with LGBTQ Christians. And so Side B and Revoice was on my radar for a little while before I ever was able to attend a conference. And I attended a conference when it was in Texas. I had just moved here, and that was the first conference that I attended. And I was a little hesitant at first because and this was really reaffirmed when I was there, the sense that there's something about this gathering of Side B folks that is so much more than just a gathering, that it is like pure oxygen to some people for whom this community and this gathering in this place is so integral and important. And as a cisgender heterosexual married woman, I didn't necessarily want to intrude upon that, to break in on some of that. We talk sometimes in race about like the white gaze, and in this case, I feel like there's something similar when folks like me are a part of what is really very sacred. And so it was. I tried to kind of be in the standing room only section, but was so blessed by that experience, and so blessed in worshiping with friends there that I was at Revoice this past year where we met, and I'm just a huge fan of all the different people that I meet in the work they're doing, like this podcast. And so I feel like in some ways my integration into Side B is purely just been an invitation of the Lord, something that I wasn't seeking out, something that I wasn't necessarily looking for. But once I started learning and about it, and as a movement, and meeting people within that movement, and of course I have a lot of students who are LGBTQ, but this has been a particular blessing to me that I don't often get to talk about very much, but I'm really glad to get to talk about it.
Thank you. Yeah. Reading your book, it is very clear. I love you intertwine so much stories of different conversations you've had over the year with students, and but your goal actually was to do a theology of intimacy. What kind of spurred on your desire to write from more of a theological lens rather than whatever other lenses might be available?
Yeah. Honestly, this whole topic of intimacy is very much part of an occupational hazard I have working with emerging adults, and particularly college students. Spend about 80% of my office hours. They're coming in talking about these things. And so as I was spending years trying to pastor them well, trying to care for them well in these things, I was realizing, am I helping? Are these resources that they're reading helping? What is actually happening? Are we getting any better at this? And it doesn't seem like we are. And it seems like the same questions are coming through generation after generation. And so when I did my doctorate and got the chance to study it, my original statement was, my problem statement for my research was, my emerging adults are struggling with their intimate relationships because they lack a robust theology of intimacy. And I used that term, because I needed a word like intimacy to broaden the scope of what I was talking about, because it wasn't just their romantic relationships. It was their friendships. It was their family life. It was this category that enveloped this type of connection, but it was not just romantic relationships. So I needed something that broadened that out. So intimacy became a word that we found that did as good a job as it could to kind of keep that umbrella wide. And then a theology of intimacy, because I thought there's got to be something that God has to say about this that isn't just proof texts about behaviors. Because I feel like our content really goes to those, and I get why. Like, they're there. This is what we have to work with. But but I didn't know if there was a theology of intimacy. And if there was one, I didn't know where it was or what it was. And so the journey was really integral for me, because this theology of intimacy at the end of the day is something that I believe orients all of the aspects of our intimate relationships that we talk about, from behaviors to feelings to identity. And because it has to be grounded in something that can speak to things like identity, that can speak to how we should live our life, that can speak to a greater kingdom good. And there isn't really anything you can do without developing a theology that goes that rests on. And so that's why. But I don't use the term theology of intimacy much when I speak about things, simply because I think it kind of makes people step back a little bit and go, oh, no, this is for me. And so I hope people are able to read the book and find how boots on the ground practical this framework is as a starting point. So
Yeah, your subtitle is Hope for All Our Intimate Relationships. And I really appreciated just your quote when you were talking about like the purpose of it. You say, the highest aim of intimacy is a generative closeness that refreshes and affirms one's identity and value while simultaneously doing the same for the other person. Can you both unpack that a little bit, maybe how you came to that? And as well, mix in how, I like that you brought in solitude at one point. And how does solitude and intimacy contribute in this ultimate like theological sense of knowing God and growing close to him?
yeah, it's sort of a convergence of different ideas that we all sort of, I think, assent to within Christianity. One is that we are created to connect with one another. We're social beings. We understand to some extent that we can't actually exist in our Christianity in isolation, that we say we have a relationship with God, and we use that word relationship, and we think, oh, we should not fail to gather. There's something about community gathering. There's something about connection that we all sort of acquiesce to in that idea, even just in a basic sense. But we also have this this idea of like, well, I also have these relationships in which what do they really have to do with God? Am I really knowing God by being in friendships or being with family, or am I just really trying to like survive living in a household with other people and figuring out who's going to take the garbage out? Like, and what does that have to do necessarily with God? And so I feel like a lot of these different ideas come together. And what I propose is that not only are we created for connection, we are actually created for intimacy. And that being created for intimacy is on purpose, that God has done this and designed this because in his hopefully infinite wisdom, he has come and placed himself via the Holy Spirit in his people to say, if you want to find me, this is where you find me. You find me in this location. I mean, God is everywhere, but ultimately Pentecost gives us a very specific sort of locale for God, which means I can't get out alive without, I can't not be in relationship with people, and not just in basic relationship, but in the kind of relationship that allows us to actually affirm the true things that speak to our identity and give us connection that we crave. And through that, we know God, which is this wild idea. And solitude is part of that too, but scholars like Erin and others describe solitude in a way that I think helps me make sense, which is I can go and do spiritual practices on my own in a way that is valuable, but only so far as they then enhance my ability to be in relationship, both with God and others. So the purpose of solitude is actually this sort of symbiotic relationship with intimate relationships. It's not antithetical. We're not like trying to get away from people. Like even when Jesus sought solitude, it was what we understand to be sort of filled up and reconnected to the Father so that he can continue to go back and be with people. And in the same way, I think there's sort of a balance between solitude and intimacy, and we have access to God in both ways, but I can't just rely on my solitude, my practices in solitude to give me everything I need for the Christian life. And I would propose that ultimately you're actually going to learn the gospel and really know God more thoroughly when you are in relationship with others, with other humans, which is wild because humans are really messy. And so we have to kind of unpack that. But ultimately, that's my position is I will not know the gospel as richly as I need to live it if I am not thinking of these relationships as a form of spiritual discipleship.
Mm.
One of the quotes that I think is right up on your website for the book is, "I can live without sex, but I cannot live without intimacy." What's your working definition for intimacy? And he says you didn't just look at theologically, you also dipped into kind of like, well, yeah, what are the components here of what intimacy is and or how to experience it?
Yeah. And I think Side B folks will know that quote because it doesn't really belong to any one person in particular. I was at a conference when I heard it from a person speaking out of a Side B context at the time, but ultimately I've now heard that sentence dozens of times, particularly from friends in Side B. And so, but at first it kind of made my brain stop. Like, I was like, what are you saying? What do you mean by intimacy? Like that was one of the driving questions I had. And that sentence lived rent free in my mind for years before I actually started studying this formally. But from what I came to understand and have tried to communicate from my side, like, there seems to be something about how we're created for intimacy, how we're created for connection, that is actually essential to us being fully human. And so that's why we can't live without it. And so that connection has something to do with God, but also has something to do with other people. And so that was a bit of a starting point for me of like, well, what's that overlap of relationship with God and relationship with people? Because even sex is something that sort of falls under this dogma of this is not something we'll have in the eschaton. This is not something that is part of humanity into the end of days and the second coming of Christ, like marriage and all of that. These things are for now, but they're for something. They're assigned towards something. They're a part of something. And I thought it can't just be those things. Surely we can expand that beyond just sex and romance to what if all of our relationships and all of that closeness and all of that intimacy, platonic, sexual, or otherwise, well, I don't know what the otherwise would be, platonic or sexual, it would be, is for something higher, for something that ultimately connects us to the Lord. And so, yeah, I think ultimately at the end of the day, like, I can't live without intimacy is a signpost that tells us something about how we're created and how God has created us and how God is inviting us into fellowship with himself, and that somehow it involves these other people. But also, even though it's a little countercultural to say I can live without sex, you can. Like, it just so many examples all throughout history of people who've done this. And I try to not give a nod to this in the book, but also I know, and I've come to learn even more now, marriages that for whatever reason, illness, disability, any number of circumstances, sexual trauma, are marriages that also don't have a sexual component. And while I think that's still a broken version of what we would want marriage to be, it is part of this broken world, in which case we have to look at everything and say, oh, this sexual experience can't be what ultimately makes me human, what ultimately gives me value. And I think that is also pointing towards this theology, something about how we understand what God is doing.
Part of the book in the earlier sections is you talk about sexual essentialism and also hypersexualization. And part of that is in relationship to how you define intimacy. So I think you've started to kind of allude your conception of sex and intimacy, but can you expand more on these particular ideas you have around like sexual essentialism as a concept and hypersexualization?
Yeah, those are really byproducts of romance idolatry and trying to understand romance idolatry. And it's really emphasis on the idolatry portion of that claim. It's a great term that actually helps, I think, frame what it is a lot of us are feeling and sensing when it comes to the primacy of romantic relationships, how everything seems to be about me landing a romantic and sexual partner. and that ultimately, like, every song, every movie, every TV show, every Taylor Swift album is doubling down on this idea that you're not somebody until somebody wants to have sex with you or wants to, like, lock you in for life. And so there's sort of secular and Christian versions of this that play out across the board, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing, and it's the idea that ultimately that is it, like, the sex essentialism and hypersexualization are the evidence that we have taken this idea of sex way too far, to say that this is what gives you meaning. Because if sex is what gives me meaning, then I have to have it. I have to. It's essential. I can't not. Now I'm aiming my energy, my time, my efforts, because if I don't land a sexual partner, what does that say about me? What does that say about who I am or how successful I am as a human being, particularly in adulthood? As a successful adult, this is how you measure what your worth is, what your value, what your level of success is. And so when we put that idolatry in, and when we say, yeah, this is what defines you ultimately, well, then you have to make sex one of the prime goals of your adult life, or in the Christian version, marriage. But hypersexualization is another way in which we've built up these industries who are making a lot of money on this idea that sex is one of the primary ways I understand my identity. It's one of the primary ways that I understand my value as a human being. And the reason this is idolatry is that comes as a personal affront to what the gospel says, which is that only Christ gives you your identity and gives you value. Nothing else gets to tell you who you are. It's not that sex is unimportant or that we should be flippant about it. I don't think there's anything in intimate relationships we should be flippant about ever. But these things, while important, no longer get to own us or define us. That's the difference the gospel makes when it comes in and says these things that are a part of your life, they're not unimportant, but they don't get to tell you who you are. Only Christ gets to do that. And so it's a little confusing in churches when we hear only the gospel gets to tell you who you are, but also if you're not landing a sexual partner and you're in your 30s and 40s, we might have questions about whether or not you matter, or what your value is, or how we can decipher what might be wrong with you. And those are dueling narratives that can't exist. But they do in our churches all the time. So here to call that out.
Erin, can I ask, how do you distinguish between romance and intimacy?
Yeah, romance is kind of another collective word where, in some ways, you're trying to encompass everything that might lead to a sexual relationship, but doesn't necessitate a sexual relationship. Disney princess type stuff, right? Like the romance is sort of an industry, encapsulates all the things that would include, or maybe not necessarily include, sexual relationships. So romance and sex are a type of intimacy, but they are not like all that there is when it comes to intimacy, which is tricky because when we use the word intimacy, people tend to think, oh, sexual things. And so it's a default oftentimes, which is, again, another evidence of romance idolatry and the saturated hypersexualization of our world. But not all romance is intimacy. Or not all intimacy is romance, but romance and sex would be included as a type of intimacy, but not all sex is intimate. And so there's some of those distinctions as well. Just because you have a romantic partner doesn't mean you actually are achieving what David read earlier about this highest aim of intimacy, this generative closeness that's refreshing who we are, which is why loneliness is a problem both in and outside of people who are coupled. We're not always getting there. So intimacy tends to be kind of this bigger term, and everything else falls under it.
Mm. I really appreciated you had some fun charts about these like three components that fuel intimacy: self-giving love, attention/curiosity, and commitment. And I actually thought the that second one, attention and curiosity, was really interesting, thinking about what that looks like in our relationship with God. Because like it might be like, oh yeah, as you like grow close to someone, you're like, oh, I want to learn more about who they are. You know, like, you like it's why you take them out on a date,
Yeah.
including friend dates,
Yeah.
because you're curious as to who they are. But I'm curious in what ways uh, any of those maybe that you've seen exemplified in scriptures, but especially that attention curiosity one.
Yeah, I love the attention curiosity piece because I think it doesn't get a lot of play. I think we don't talk about it enough, but the charts are really extrapolations from social scientists who have studied intimate relationships. It's a science. Like we can actually study it. We actually know the component ingredients for successful, healthy, sustainable relationships, both in marriage and in friendship and just in any type of intimate relationship. And so I to try to get out of the total nerddom that is my life, I made a chart that makes me want to hide from like my social science friends a little bit because it's so reductionistic. But ultimately, it works for the book, and it's like, look, these are the pieces. If you have these things, this is part of the recipe for what makes for those relationships. But what I find interesting is that all of these things really can be sort of drawn back to sort of the inner life of the Trinity. And so when we peer inside the Trinity, we don't know everything about the Trinity, but what we do know helps sort of demonstrate to us where this comes from, why this matters, why it works for our human relationships, because God is the part exemplar of this way of living. And so, so in terms of attention and curiosity, in many ways, I think the entire meta narrative of Scripture is chronicling God's attention for us, this sort of this gravitas and this desire. And when we do that for each other, honestly, anything in that chart, when we do it for each other, I think it's an act of holiness, because what we're doing is we're imaging and we're mimicking God, who would be the ultimate source for all of these things and why they would be good in the first place. And so yeah, I think attention and curiosity, though, was always one of my favorites, because I feel like if we all were committed to being a little bit more attentive and a little bit more curious, just in any of our relationships, that would be a major game changer, as we're all a little self-absorbed and a little into ourselves in ways that, yeah, we're not very good at this, especially in friendship, where we've kind of let things slide because it hasn't been as created important to us as romance. So
Yeah, makes me think of whichever psalm where David says, you know, who is man that you are mindful of him?
yeah.
One of the other cultural themes you hit on was autonomy. Could you speak to maybe even which of these three components of intimacy, how does autonomy specifically attack that? And maybe, yeah, what does autonomy look like in our culture, and that stops our relationships?
Yeah. And this is really a cocktail, right? Entitlement, autonomy, and productivity. Because there's something to be said for agency and being able to have sort of authority within it, which is actually very good and healthy. But I'm trying to describe values that we tend to just sort of unconsciously accept in Western society in particular, that sort of spring from these other ideas of like individualization and personal freedoms. But they've sort of morphed and distorted over time. And so what we get is this tension between these things and our desire for intimate relationships. I was actually just talking with a colleague about this today, because we were trying to define what does a caring community look like in a place like a higher education setting like Baylor. And we were talking about, like, in terms of our Christian commitment, what are things that anchor us in that are also easy to access for people who are not from a Christian background. Things like inherent dignity, which we would say is bestowed to us by a creator, or loving our neighbor, or living in harmony and peaceably. And then one of my colleagues brought up, yeah, but there's a need. Like we're baked with this desire and this need, and this need for vulnerability with one another. And that's a very Christian idea. And I'm like, absolutely. But as soon as you go there, you're going to come up against a value that is also really hard and very like debatable when we get into this level, which is my autonomy. So I did like a workshop with some students recently in a class I was teaching, where I had them go to different sides of the room, yes, no, maybe, based on different statements. And one of the statements was, you made plans with your friends, but you get a better offer. Do you break plans with them? And most of the students are on the no side. They're like, no way. No, like I've got a few that are like, no, my friends would be happy for me if I get a better offer. It's great. It's a lot of fun with the students, but a lot of them are like, no, I'm loyal. You don't break plans with your friends. This is loyalty. This is importance. My friends are great. And so then the next question is, you have plans to go out with your friends, but you're really tired and you just want to spend a little time by yourself. Do you break plans? And you see them slowly start walking sheepishly toward the yes. And they're like, if I need to do self-care, like that's different, and so like we get into this, right? These debates about, okay, at what level does autonomy come in? Of course, these are very simple, accessible examples where we can sort of debate the merits of them, but that's the tension we're living in, is that we have this cultural value that says, I need to look out for me. I need to, and some of these things are good, like setting good boundaries with people, doing good self-care, having spiritual disciplines that we do with just us and the Lord. But a lot of times in Western culture, this idea of autonomy actually butts up against and is a threat to our ability to connect with and be vulnerable with others. This is basically the entire framework for the technology we have. Technology is here to sell us a way to have connection and intimacy while maintaining autonomy. So I don't have to get into the messiness with people. I can just send nudes. It's like we have dating apps that are set up like literal transactions, swiping, everything from pornography to parasocial relationships is set up so that we can feel like we're connected to something without the mess. We still maintain our autonomy. We don't have to actually deal with reciprocity or another person's emotions. And the reason we have such a booming industry in Western society of these sort of things that are being sold to us to maintain that technology, connection dynamic is because I think a lot of us really struggle with the pull of our sort of value of autonomy and having to sacrifice that to go deeper with people we love. And it's just hard. I won't say it's easy, but it's a reality that we have to constantly reflect on. So.
Yeah, I'm curious, Erin, just as you think and talk about intimate relationships, I know that like artificial intelligence is something that sort of poses maybe some complications for how people think about intimate relationships, particularly young people who are about to grow up in a world where artificial intelligence is just ubiquitous. So I'm curious if you had thoughts about like the ways in which young people might form relationships with chatbots, or like how that would shape their understanding of intimacy and what the gospel might speak to that reality, that new incoming reality.
Yeah, gosh, this is huge. I mean, this is a whole other, like, you could just start a podcast about just this because there's so much to go into. My book doesn't actually mention AI because from between the time I was writing the original manuscript and editing the final versions, AI chatbots blew up. And so like, that's how fast this happens. But I have my Gen Zers in college are still pushing against the chatbot allure in many ways, or at least they're speaking to it. They're saying, no, embodied friendships are still better. And yet, and I think this is going to be particularly difficult with Gen Alpha, some of the younger ones that we're seeing. One of my colleagues talked about her daughter who's in middle school was on the family iPad the other day. And it looked like she was texting. And she was like, oh, you texting with one of your friends, honey? And she was like, no, I'm talking to this chat bot, but we've been talking for hours. And she's like, oh, wouldn't you want to just talk to one of your friends? And she's like, no, because I love this musical and none of my friends have seen that musical, but this chatbot knows everything. And we've had this whole conversation and it's been so fun. And I would much rather talk to this chatbot because they get me. And that's just friendship. I mean, there's a whole darker area when we're talking about simulated romantic and sexualized relationships over AI, which is, I mean, it just takes our modern sort of technological pornography situation and just pours gasoline on it. So there's all kinds of dangers there. But I was listening. Andy Crouch was at Baylor this week, and I was in one of the seminars that he was doing, and he had us all talk to our neighbors about the last time we like really felt alive, like the last time we felt like this is living, this is what life is. And we were sort of unpacking that. But one of the questions he asked the room of a few hundred people, he said, how many of these examples were in a digital or virtual world? And nobody raised their hands. And it was just like a quick moment where he was just like, at the end of the day, we still, not that technology isn't a tool sometimes to help us get there or to help bridge a gap where we are lacking that embodiment, but ultimately we are embodied beings. We're not going to ever be satisfied. We're not going to ever feel that connection as it's simulated through media. Like it can be a useful tool, it can be valuable, but it just isn't the real thing. And so no matter how advanced this gets, I think that same problem will persist. It'll just persist in different forms. And boy, it moves really fast. It's hard to be ready.
Erin, could you share why you contrast intimate relationships with economic relationships?
Yeah. These are sort of your basic categories for relationships. Most relationships that we have are economic. Like my relationship with my barista or a lot of my colleagues. Now, some of my colleagues are friends, and so that's different. They're a colleague and they're a friend. But most of the time we can identify relationships in two different categories. And most of the relationships and acquaintanceships that we have, while they can be warm, they're transactional. They're based on some sort of transaction. I get along with my boss, but at the end of the day, he makes sure I get my work done and I make sure I get a paycheck. So like there's something that actually holds this relationship together that is more than just, do we get along and do we like each other? So economic relationships can be warm, but they're not intimate. Like I'm not going to have my favorite barista. I'm not going to hand them the keys to my car or my apartment. I'm not going to, I'm not going to be handing people PIN numbers to my accounts without something that actually makes them intimate, which would already be categorically separate in terms of trust and closeness and accountability. And so these are just categories that help us understand that. And I think one of the ways it's particularly valuable, David, is that we have transactional ways of doing relationships that are always creeping into our intimate relationships and threatening that intimacy. So we talk to a lot of couples that are getting ready to get married, and we talk about this idea of scorekeeping, how it's really bad as a young couple to devolve down to, well, I did this and now you did this, and so I have this many points and you have this many points. That's very economic. That reduces people down to mechanisms, and that actually will threaten your ability to have intimacy, because every time we sort of try to get our head around relationships and try to get them small enough to where we can control or feel safe within that control, a lot of times is what's driving us. we reduce people to parts, we reduce people to functions, we reduce people in a way that functions in an economic relationship, but is not good for an intimate relationship. So I think having these categories is helpful because we're always having to look to push back against those transactional mechanisms in our intimate relationships.
Yeah, thank you. The mechanistic aspect of it definitely um or I can't think of the word I'm looking for right now, but resonates, that's the word. Resonates with me in thinking about that dynamic and how, yeah, we can get almost calculated in our relationships, so that tit for tat, rather than this exchange of love. But when I first read it, I actually was like, huh? Because of Andy Crouch, actually, and some of his work around household as the oikos, and that like the all of life starts out in that economy of household management,
Yeah.
and living in a community house. I've been struck by how much the economics of our household, of like buying food and cooking food and eating it together, is so fundamental to our intimate relationships together. And that I think one of the phrases used is like trust building behaviors, or trust
Yeah.
building, actions. And of like, oh, a lot of my trust building and that even reaffirming of my dignity of like, you're valuable and you're worth, as TJ I think said, like, you're worth being kept alive, because that's why I want to share food with you. um
Yeah.
so I hear what you're saying. I was like, oh yeah, definitely. But I've just thought through economics in a way that has been more centered around household and relationship. um
Yeah.
so that's why I was curious, because I used the word a little differently.
Yeah, could I add
Yeah. No.
something? Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Go ahead, teach. No, go ahead.
Yeah, that was also surprising to me because I'm kind of used to economic solidarity being a very prominent part of intimate relationships. David Frank mentioned a quote I once said, and it's come from an African. I've lived a lot of my life in African context since I was young, and there's a certain idea that we know a mother loves their kid because they cook for them, which is intrinsically focused on they actually want them to survive by giving them food. It doesn't mean it's the only dynamic of human life, but that is one prominent dynamic. And if a mother didn't love her kids, she would stop like feeding them. And then thus they don't survive anymore. So yeah. So it was an odd distinction to me, even though it reminds me of kind of Western philosophy and like Aristotle's sort of idea of like disinterested or interested friendship, or these levels of friendship where like you get more transactional as you go out, kind of, or there's our friendships based on transaction, but they're not virtuous friendships. So I kind of got that, but it seems kind of disembodied too, to remove economic solidarity from these intimate relationships, I guess, which seems also crucial. So yeah,
Yeah,
anyways.
and I would agree that it is. The idea of economic versus intimate relationships is really to help us define categories of the fact that there's within intimacy, there's family, there's friendship, and there's romantic sexual relationships that would fall what social scientists would put under like intimate relationships. But especially when households and proximity are a part of this. Well, honestly, even with just any type of intimate relationship, you have components that require, so yeah, some of that economic solidarity. So like with a married couple sharing a household together, like some of it is just figuring out who's going to take out the trash and like who's going to, you know, pick up the groceries and whose turn it is to do these sort of things. Now, you wouldn't define the relationship in them just being good roommates. In fact, we would say marriages are heading in a wrong direction if they are suddenly just reduced to being roommates, right? Just people who might be good roommates, but if that's what defines their relationship, then that's actually not an intimate relationship. They're just good roommates, which is fine and good and warm, but also the marriage portion cannot live solely off of just this idea of the sexual romantic, which actually is also a pretty small slice of pie, an important slice, but small. The friendship is actually the greater part. So when we're thinking about what makes for good marriages, we're actually starting with the component parts of what makes for good friendships. And some of that is the economic solidarity that undergirds that. But it's not in and of itself enough to be the whole of an intimate relationship. So while it's a component part, in fact, every relationship that is intimate comes from something economic. Like you can see economic relationships that are moving towards intimacy. So they're not completely bifurcated so much as they have a relationship. But I think in some ways, when we try to take things that should be intimate, that should be dignifying of ourselves and others, and reduce them to functions and reduce them to transactions, then we're working against what an intimate relationship is for, unless you're in an economic relationship, and then it's fully appropriate to do that. I wouldn't say to undignify anyone, but ultimately, again, it's not going to, me talking to my boss about a pay raise is not going to somehow be detrimental to our relationship, because that's what this is what we're doing. This is what's happening. So yeah, just I think categories, but I appreciate that you guys brought this up, because it doesn't mean that intimate relationships don't have these components. In fact, they're kind of built on them, but then they go somewhere from there.
It makes me think of Paul. He's like, even if you burn yourself at the stake, but if you don't have love, it means nothing. And similar with like the trash taking out in the home, you can do that just as like the checklist management thing, but it can be transformed if it's actually that self-giving thing of love, of like, oh, I'm taking out the trash so that, my house partner is happy in the morning because they see that trash is clean, and there's less flies going around.
Yeah. And these would be behaviors and practices, right? They don't remove anything. They don't become just transactions, but they become practices that become conduits of love and trust. So, yeah. And TJ, Aristotle only believed in friendship among equals. So really it was the women and the slaves that were doing all the economic work. Just to note that.
Erin, could you share, for queer and same-sex attracted Christians, have you found them more often more adept or more restricted in their lives with regards to building healthy, intimate relationships?
Such a good question. I would say there is a burden of necessity to have to think more often and more deeply about these topics. And because of that, I think that can lead, and oftentimes I will see it lead to a much more thoughtful way of approaching relationships. I think that, again, romance idolatry and just having sort of this singular focus on romance alone can make us really lazy, especially because romance idolatry saturates us with this story that we're supposed to be building. Everyone wants this good story. And so we're really focused on that and not necessarily virtues within relationship. Whereas if you are living in a space where you're like, well, romance and sexual relationships may not be what I'm going for, may not be what my life and my aim is about. There's a lot that has to be recovered that is deeply anemic in our society. And I would say Side B leads out on this, like is been the ones who have been championing this, who've been bringing, I mean, even romance idolatry comes from, Side B. Like there's so many things that we have just had the ability to just like not have to think about. The Side B's like, no, we have to, we may die. We need people. We need intimacy. We need homes. We need connection. We need a life, and we're built for this. And we believe that this is part of God's goodness for us. And so we have to figure this out. I don't think that would necessitate us being better at it, because we're all pretty crappy at it. The people I love most in my life are also the people that I can be just awful with. It doesn't make any sense. It's absolutely ridiculous. And yet, this is why I really believe at the end of the day, the theology bit that we kind of talked about at the beginning, that the only thing that allows us to do this well is the gospel, because I'm my best self when I remember that I'm free and that I'm full and that I'm beloved and I lack nothing for life and godliness. And I come that way to my relationships. I'm not trying to manipulate people. I'm not in a functional atheism that says it's all up to me. I have to do this. No one's coming to help me. I'm all on my own. The only thing that gives me the ability to overcome those lies is something very, very true. That is so true. It is true because of Christ and not for any other reason. And I can have to reach out and remember that in order to live out of that true identity, not some false narrative being sold to me. But I think we're all there. I think we're all there. And side B folks are living in a water saturated with romance idolatry just as much as any of us. So I think it's easy to hold conviction with this and still sometimes feel like I don't know if I matter. Why does everyone else get like? I think there's just those temptations and ideas that we're all fighting against. That side B is in a similar place, but I am grateful that side B as a movement exists because the people I've met and continue to meet challenge me in ways that have changed my life when it comes to how I exist in my relationships now. This book changed my life. That's why I wrote it. Because these concepts are so integral, and I'm appreciative to side B for championing them. And I want, as someone who's sort of outside of the community in many ways, to know what I can do to support that and to be there for them in their journey in really tangible ways. I figured that's part of what I give, what I'm here to do and give back. And that's still a learning process. But yeah, no, side B's great, but we're all still messing up into their relationships.
Mhm.
But that I don't think there's anything particular about queerness or same-sex attraction that is beholden to that so much as we're just messy humans.
Mhm. And I appreciated you had a line where you said it was something about basically like our origins impact us significantly, and how difficult or how good it is to form intimate relationships, secure attached relationships. But there is no amount of trauma or past that is beyond gospel repair and God's work in us.
Yeah, if I wanted to ask a practical question, if I could, Erin.
Yeah.
My number one side B foible is falling in love with my friends. And if I was at Baylor as a student, I 100% would have come to my chaplain to ask, how do I handle that situation? So I'm kind of curious, and I feel like this is pretty common for queer people in side B. So I was curious if you have like thoughts about how you would advise a student who's experiencing that tension. And wondering like, can I even be friends with people and cultivate intimate relationships? Because there's always this threat that I will like fall in love with a friend, or there's maybe like a fear of sin there or something. I'm just kind of curious what you would say to that.
Yeah. No, I think there are probably two things here that come immediately to mind. One is that, especially as a college student, it's such early days when it comes to like being a mature person in relationships. So gonna keep those expectations low. And one of the ways I would encourage a student who is struggling with friendships, sparking romantic feelings in them, is to recognize in some ways that the most intimate of friendships, both in scripture and in Christian history, have an element of romance within them that is still platonic and non-sexual, but there's attraction that's part of friendship. There is deep connection that is part of friendship. There's longing that is part of friendship. And it's so close to our understanding of like sexual romantic relationships that in some ways it's very difficult to ultimately parse what's happening in sort of that gray area. And so I would want to give some grace to the fact that there is, I think, for people who we just love so deeply that we have to recognize there's a certain element of attraction that doesn't have to necessitate a sexual relationship, but that it also doesn't mean, oh no, I'm cooked, I can't, and now we don't have a friendship anymore because of this strong pull. I think in some ways, allowing ourselves a little space to be people who are connecting deeply with others means that there's a risk there always, but that ultimately we just have to welcome and understand that some of that is actually natural and doesn't necessitate something sexual. But it's such a thin line, especially because romance idolatry continues to feed in, right? This idea that we don't know how to pump the brakes at a certain point, because there's still that idea that like, oh, this idea of this romantic relationship with this person just feels like the ultimate culmination of what I actually want. And I would say that that's a lie, that ultimately we don't actually need romantic or sexual relationships to be fulfilled human beings, but it's a lie we have to constantly fight against. But the other side of that is the fact that for the person who is trying to enter into these friendships and not have sexual relationships, not have them become sexual romantic relationships, or the fear of that sort of temptation, is really a space that we all exist. Because even as a married woman, I can't just go around and have sex with whoever I want. And if I'm attracted to other people, I don't just get to act on that. And even if I feel it strongly, like there are people in other intimate relationships in my life that can never become sexual or romantic. And so in some ways, we're all bound under the virtue of chastity, that single or married otherwise is no different in terms of what we're all beholden to when it comes to people that we just feel very strongly and connected to. So there is a discipline there. But I think we can encourage each other, because I think something we don't talk about enough when we talk about intimate relationships is we don't talk about, this is going to sound weird, but we don't talk enough about dying. It's like, what? It felt like a zig. We thought you were going to zag. It's like, it's all about love. But when we look at like 1 Corinthians and passages that talk about like our being in Christ as a new creation is life that comes through a form of death. And we think about sacrifice, and we think about the components of love. We think about what vulnerability and intimacy requires. There's always death that comes through the ability to get closer and closer and closer to a person. This is, again, that tug with autonomy things. We have to be able to sacrifice, and this has to be done in a healthy way, but ultimately we're always learning how to die for the sake of life. And that's the way of Christ. So it's safe and it's good, and we don't have to be afraid of that. But when it comes to these strong connections we have with people, and we're worried about them engendering these romantic feelings or these sexual ideations, I think at the end of the day, it is not a punishment or a curse to learn how to be cruciform in our chastity, because then what we get is the great connection that lives safely somewhere where we don't have to worry about what it becomes. And that's really hard to do and maintain. So we have to encourage each other in that. We have to have people that are helping us with that in our marriages and outside of, like, in our singleness, to say, like, there's a water's edge we come to where this is the best and it doesn't tip over into darkness. But I think we have to be able to do that. And if we can't do that, we have to set a boundary. And it might mean the friendship has to pull away. And it might mean there has to be a reset and just some things put into place so that we don't bring that darkness into something really beautiful. But I don't think we ever condemn the thing itself. I don't think we ever say that that's an awful thing. I think that's how God created us. And boy, I hope that for everyone. I hope for everyone to have relationships with people that they love so strongly that they're worried about falling deeply romantically in love with them. What a wonderful place to be. It's just precarious because of the mess, but I'm happy to hold you at this place so that you don't fall forward. And I would hope there'd be people to hold me. So maybe we build communities that do that for each other.
And yeah, thank you. I find that framing so helpful, and along with just that initial description of the purpose of intimacy, of that being the generative closeness that for this affirmation of identity. And so instead of, I think we can tend to this like, oh, is that good intimacy or bad intimacy? Or am I allowed to have intimacy with that person? Am I allowed to be drawn to that person? Oh no, I'm drawn to that person. It's like, no, that's the wrong way. It's just, and I think chastity is one of those things that helps us regulate and see, and just think through, is my intimacy helping affirm that person's all of who that God has made them to be? And if it's not affirming them as a brother, a sister, a husband, a wife, whatever, all the different things that God has built into them, maybe my longing for that person is actually contorting them to fit my desires. And that's then the death comes into the picture of, I actually need to die to some of my desires in this so that I can love them better and support them. And that being like the true, I guess, tug and pull of intimacy. So thank you. And I guess before we wrap to a close, do you just have any final thoughts that you'd want to share with our listeners?
I just want to encourage anyone out there who's listening, who's queer, same-sex attracted, that you were made for intimacy on purpose by God. And that journey towards what that means in a life that may not ever have a sexual relationship is still such a good and such a pursuit, and one that I think within the strength of the community we can do with each other safely, because we will hold each other in that journey. And I, for one, am somebody who wants to continue to encourage and be some of the scaffolding along the wall that allows that journey to be good, even in the ache and the pain of it all. And so just grateful to anybody who's listening who I've not had the privilege to meet. I'm encouraged by you, and I'm here, and there's other people that I represent that are here because we love you, and you are deeply loved. And if that is just something you needed to hear today, know that it is good despite the ache. You got this.
Thank you, Erin. And in the show notes, we'll include a link to your website where people can learn more about your book and your work. Is there any other way that people should connect to you if they were interested?
I mean, I have a website. Every time I say this in like a public forum, like I throw up a little bit in the back of my mouth, because it's just like the amount of hubris one has to have a personal website. It's awful. Like, it's just like our website, but it's an easy connecting point for all the things. It's like technology's the devil, but follow me on Insta. It's just like one of those things where I'm always living in this juxtaposition because I wrote a book and you got to sell it. But no, I actually really love connecting with people, so that would probably be the easiest way.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, listeners, for joining. I hope you were stirred and blessed as we were. Thank you so much, Erin. Grateful for this work, for your ongoing, just love for the church, for the Side B community, and for all those who are just trying to figure out life wherever they're at. Amen. With that messiness. May the Lord keep blessing the work of your hands, Erin, both at person, at Baylor, and through whatever other networks he sends you through.
Appreciate that. Thank you. So good to be with y'all today.
If you want to support our work, tell a friend about an episode that you enjoyed. People who value this podcast usually find it through someone else. If you'd like to help us cover costs, you can become a supporter on Substack. While all episodes are available to current and future listeners, paid subscribers get extra sign-up perks.